What would you say, since now we're kind of on to flood geology, what are some of the very best lines of evidence that point to a global flood, Dr. Grady?
Well, I think I've mentioned many of them, of course. Now, the evolutionists believe in what is called historical geology, and they point to the sedimentary layers in the ground, the fossils that are in the layers, and they deceive people into believing that they are in a certain specific order and that that order is found everywhere. Um, Such as, say, in the Grand Canyon. They say, oh, you've all seen pictures of the Grand Canyon. You've all seen these exposed layers of sedimentary rock. Now, sedimentary rock is just dried out mud, period. Three kinds of rock, basic, all right? We've got a metamorphic, igneous, and sedimentary. Now, sedimentary rock is nothing but dried out mud. Now, let's just talk about a couple of numbers for a second. Approximately 75 to 80% of the Earth's dry land surface is covered with dried out mud layers containing trillions of dead plants and animals that all drowned. Now, first of all, that is not slow and gradual as evolutionists claim. That is a catastrophic one-year flood by definition. Secondly, the layers are not in the order that evolutionists claim they are in the textbooks. Again, my question to the audience, I was an evolutionist. I earned my science degrees as an evolutionist. I taught it from the 7th grade to the university level. But how many of you ever went out, dug in the ground to see whether or not they were telling you the truth?
Right, good point.
So I didn't until after I'd gotten my bachelor's degree with honors in evolutionary science. And then I started to become a little skeptical. Now, I didn't change until I was 27, and for other reasons, but nonetheless, I was becoming skeptical of what I had been taught. Now, of the 75 to 80% of the Earth's dry land surface that's covered with dried out mud layers containing trillions of dead plants and animals that all drowned, of that, 80 to 85% does not even have 3 of the layers shown in the textbook in the right order. What evolutionists don't tell you is they take the layers from different places in the world. They take a layer from China, a layer from Canada, a layer from the Congo, a layer from Brazil, and they put the layers in the order they want them, and then claim that the layers prove that they're right. Now, I don't know about you. I wasn't born yesterday. If you're allowed to rearrange the evidence, you can prove anything you want. Is that correct? So first of all, it's a disingenuous thing. They put the layers in the order they want them and then claim proof. Now, that is a form of logic the Greeks called a tautology that falls on its own weight. You cannot say that the layers prove your theory, but then that you put the layers in the order according to your theory. It's invalid. Now, there are other problems with that. I mentioned the Grand Canyon, by the way. There are 3 areas of the Grand Canyon where there are vast amounts of layers missing. While they say there's 500 million years there, it's not true. It's only about 360, according to their methodology. So there's about 140 million missing there, just to start with, in 3 different places. The entire Silurian is missing, for instance, that ought to be there. Other problems with it, though. The layers are upside down, backwards, missing, interlaced. We have what are called polystrate fossils. Poly, many, straight, stratum, meaning layers. And so polystrate fossils, while they are normally tree roots and tree trunks, they can be bone. As a matter of fact, if one really wanted to go to the extreme of the definition of a polystrate fossil, all fossils are polystrate except for single-celled creatures. Think about it for a second. For instance, out in Kansas, Nebraska, and in other areas of the West, we find creatures that were buried alive and are not disarticulated, meaning that in the fossil record, normally what we find is one bone of one creature in one place at one time. Or we find 1 million bones, but there are 1 million bones from 100,000 different creatures just all mixed together. It's very rare to find articulated bones in the fossil record, meaning if you found a skeleton that even had 8 contiguous vertebrae, that's a serious find to an evolutionist. And from that, they will try to recreate a creature that may not have existed. And many have been mismade because of that. However, When you find a fossil that has 97% of its bones there, that is considered to be absolutely a world famous find. Okay. Now, out in Nebraska, Kansas, and so forth, we find rhinoceros and other large creatures that all died at one time, buried alive, and the bones are not disarticulated. Now, that speaks of rapid burial. And when we take a look at the fossil record around the world, we see everything was buried rapidly in wet mud layers for the most part. Now, some were buried by volcanic dust, but mostly it's dried out mud. And a polystrate fossil, meaning a fossil which penetrates many layers, like tree trunks. And any coal miner has seen them by the bazillions. The public doesn't see a lot of them unless they go to a place where they're specifically drawn to look at them. But I have photographs of polystrate fossils from all over the world. And so the big thing is many of them don't have roots or tops. They're just tree trunks. So we have to ask ourselves a question. Did the tree grow there without tops or bottoms for millions of years while these layers formed around them? And what makes it worse is in some places the tree trunks are upside down. So now we ask the question, did the tree grow upside down without tops or bottoms for millions of years while these layers formed around them? You see, these are the kinds of things that show that evolution is not true. A recent find down in South America has dinosaur footprints, irrefutable dinosaur footprints. There's no question about it. Nobody questions it. But the slope is 70 degrees. Now, the dinosaurs had to be walking in mud to leave the footprints, and they had to be walking on a relatively flat surface. Then those footprints had to be covered rapidly to preserve them. But now they're dried, fossilized, or hardened, and now they're at a 70-degree angle to flat. Well, that means that the entire slab had to be folded while it was still wet. Because if it was folded after it was dried out, it would break and crack in many fractures, correct?
Correct.
We see folded layers all over the world, and we see layers that are out of order all over the world. For example, many people will be familiar with a very famous mountain in the Alps called the Matterhorn. Now, the Matterhorn mountain is made out of 4 major layers of dried out mud. Now, one would think if evolution was true, the youngest layer should be at the top. Is that correct? And the oldest layer at the bottom?
Right. Yeah.
And so if we numbered them from the youngest to the oldest, with number 1 being the youngest, then number 1 should be at the top, and then number 2 below it, number 3 below that, and the oldest, number 4, should be at the bottom, correct? The fact of the matter is, the Matterhorn isn't in that order at all. It actually goes 2, 3, 4, 1. The youngest layer is at the bottom, according to evolutionary thinking. And we find that in mountains all over the world. We find the layers out of order, missing, tremendous folding of them, that it could only have been done while they were still wet. Could not have been done after they were dried out. And so we look at geology, and what we see in geology is what is called flood geology. That all these layers were formed during one really big worldwide flood lasting 1 year. It occurred about 4,500 years ago.
Right. So just as you articulated it, it appears that all the geology, all the polystrate fossils, just the fossil record in general supports, massive death and burial on a global scale, and that's exactly what the Bible has described for us. So,
that's correct. And so geology is a vastly superior interpretation of the physical evidence than historical geology. And there's many other things, unconformities,
right? Yeah.
Plane surfaces. There's all kinds of stuff in geology. We can't get into all of it tonight.
Well, everything you've said is phenomenal evidence for a global flood. It's evidence against uniformitarian processes. You've got the evolutionists, Dr. Grady. They'll say you've got this type of fossil in this layer, and these types of fossils in these layers, and it goes from marine fossils to land fossils in the order of evolution. What's the best argument against that? Because it appears that it would be a burial order more consistent with the flood.
Well, first of all, The layers in the ground do, in a very general sense, often follow the order that evolutionists would claim. But of course, that would be expected in flood geology as well, because in a flood, creatures with seashells, clams and oysters, they don't have legs. They can't move anywhere. They're going to get buried at the bottom. As a matter of fact, I have a great question for your audience. If you've seen fossil clams in a museum, have you ever seen one that was open and fossilized? And I would bet you that you have never seen one that was open and fossilized, that they were all closed, where if it had two valves, both shells were together, and you had a fossil oyster or a fossil clam. Is that correct?
Right. That's a great point. Yeah.
That means they were buried alive. And the weight of the dirt on top of them was so much that they couldn't open even when they died. But what happens on the surface with clams and oysters? When they die, the muscle relaxes, the shell opens, they are eaten by scavengers, and eventually the shell hinge dissolves away, and you end up with two pieces. When you walk on the beach, you find two shells, not together. Is that correct? Secondly, I would point out that if you look at the fossil record, while in general, there is this gradual seashells at the bottom for very obvious reasons, and the large land animals at the top, because they've got legs, they can walk in a flood, they can go to higher ground until finally they will drown. What's interesting too about that is when we find dinosaurs, for instance, they have a certain position where the neck and head are pulled way back and the tail is pulled up over their back in a death throw position, which is indicative of drowning. Secondly, if I may, in the fossil record, I mentioned the layers being out of order. That's all over the place. So it's not in the way they say it. And they use a false method of dating. They date the layers by the fossils, but then they date the fossils by the layers. Again, this is self-serving circular reasoning. How do you know this rock is 200 million years old? Well, it contains a fossil that, according to our theory, is 200 million years old. So therefore, I know the rock's 200 million years old. You ask somebody else, how do you know this fossil is 200 million years old? Well, we found it inside a piece of rock that's 200 million years old. It is self-serving circular reasoning, meaning absolutely nothing. Now, this out-of-place layers that I mentioned before, again, is found all over the world where the layers are not in the order they show in the textbooks. We have all of these things which refute the fact that they were laid down slowly and gradually, but in fact were laid down rapidly. The methods by which they date them are either philosophically nonsense or technically don't work. Carbon-14 doesn't work. It has 20 scientific flaws. Potassium argon doesn't work. It has 6 scientific flaws. Now, these are fatal flaws. So there's no modern technology that can date anything accurate beyond written record. And the idea of dating rocks by fossils and fossils by rocks is absolutely vacuous. Therefore, they have no reason to believe in the age of them except by faith. That's why I said earlier, this is a religion.